The Austrian Audio Hi-X55 is an excellent headphone. It has fantastic build, class-leading comfort, and a fairly unique sound. Recently, we compared the X55 to the Neumann ND-H20. Both headphones are far apart from each other in many respects. In the sound category, the ND-H20 is claustrophobic, warmer, less detailed, and with below-average soundstage, which has a weird resonance and timbre with some instruments. The X55 has cleaner sound with above-average soundstage, better instrument and vocal separation, better instrument placement, and far better clarity and detailed retrieval. Now we turn to the Ollo Audio S4R. Ollo Audio is a Slovenian company that has 3 headphones. Their latest is the S4X, a refined version of their older headphones. The S4R is a close-back design. I previously reviewed the S4R and explained that it is among the most neutral headphones you can buy. The S4R costs about $300. The X55 costs about, $300. Let's go head-to-head. There is a lot of difference in build and comfort between these headphones. The X55 is mostly metal with slight plastic accents above the ear cups and a plastic driver housing. The X55 folds into a compact size. There is no squeaking or wobbliness. The X55 is not as robust as the ND-H20, but it is leagues better than the $400 LCD-1 or the cheaper M40X from Audio-Technica. The S4R is a mixture of metal and wood. The ear cups have a wood housing and the back cover is metal. The headband is also metal. The headband is self-adjusting type, the kind which does not require any fuss. The S4R has ear cups that swivel full 360 degrees. I have owned the S4R for about a year and have used them extensively. The wood accents have gained a darker shade with handling and the back plate on the ear cups have some minor scratches, but the headphones are still in excellent condition. As for comfort, the X55 wins hands down. The clamping force is fairly similar between these headphones, but the big difference is the earpad shape and padding. The X55 has very big, rectangular earpads that engulf ears. On the other hand, the S4R's earpads barely sit around the ears, and depending on your ear size, the S4R might actually feel like an on-ear design. The earpads on the S4R have foam. It's a little spongy, but fairly soft. The X55 has true memory foam earpads and headband padding. The headband has no padding on the S4R, but because of the self-adjusting mechanism, I don't really think that's a problem. Moreover, the X55 has ear cups that swivel left and right, up and down. This means no matter what your head shape and size, the ear cups will likely conform to you. The S4R's ear cups only rotate around 360 degrees, as I said. You cannot move them up and down. Overall, the build is fantastic for both headphones, though each comes from a different perspective. Before we can start testing, we need to understand what the claims are for these headphones. Austrian Audio doesn't really have a clear statement about what the X55 is meant to do. All they say is that the X55 was made for contemporary music, and that's pretty vague. But I think the X55 works well for every type of genre. Ollo Audio claims that their headphones have the most neutral sound signature of any headphone. They say their headphones have neutral, natural response. There is some difference in what both companies say. Ollo's approach is to provide accurate, true sound as it was recorded. The idea is that Ollo does not accentuate any particular frequency. Austrian Audio does not really claim the same thing. They merely say that the tuning is such that you can use the headphones for modern music application. Let's see what these theories provide in practice. For the sound test, I plugged both headphones into an A/B switch. I used 4 sources. I used the audeze HUD MX2, the hifi HipDAC, the Loxg P20 with the Shit Modi 3, and the Monolith Liquid Spark with the Shit Modi 3. I played music over Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match to the best of my ability. The bass response of these headphones is not as starkly different as the one between the X55 and the ND-H20. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the song starts with a rumble effect. That rumble is present for at least the first minute and then continues when other instruments play. That rumble is supposed to have an ominous sensation. On the S4R, I heard the rumble but did not actually feel it. The rumble was in the background and I had to increase volume to bring up the sound. When the crescendo hits at the middle of the song, the organ is full and present. It cuts right through the other instruments. However, it does meld with the other instruments as well. The separation on the S4R is better than on the NDH-20. The sub-bass reverberation is fairly accurate with decay that I think is pretty true to real life. On the X55, the sub-bass rumble was just a fraction quieter than on the S4R. The separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was much cleaner and more obvious on the X55, however. But it was evident that the sub-bass also had faster decay than the S4R, making the rumble effect less than truly accurate. When the crescendo hits at the middle of the song, the organ cut right through. But unlike the S4R, there was more clarity among all the other instruments. I heard multiple different instruments, while on the S4R, there was just more melding and less detail. In Conquer by Overwork, the X55 had accurate, fast, and neutral mid-bass impact. The electronic music was clear and distinct and unaffected by the bass. Sub-bass was still less than actually neutral, and I kept wishing there was a few decibels boost in that region. The S4R clearly has more sub-bass emphasis compared to the X55, by marginal accounts. On Conquer, the S4R has slightly more mid-bass impact, but also much less sub-bass and mid-bass separation than on the X55. The electronic music was about one step behind the drums, whereas on the X55 it was one step ahead. The S4R had less clarity in the song. In exchange, the S4R was a little less fatiguing on this song, which has an overabundant use of electronic nonsense. This is my personal preference coming into play, but I have to emphasize that the S4R was just a little easier to use on this particular track. I listened to a number of hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, Uproar, New Patek, and Reel It In. On the S4R, the sub-bass was just about neutral, providing a rumble that did not become bloated. Sub-bass and mid-bass was certainly melded, however. Vocals remained about one step ahead of all the other instruments, but did not have the sparkle most hip-hop songs add. Sometimes I heard less clear vocals on the S4R because of the bass, which melded with the mids. In Uproar, the vocalist was about shoulder to shoulder with the bass instruments. In New Patek, the vocals were again shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In fact, this was the case for all the hip-hop songs I tested. The vocals were generally clear with this genre, but there was melding between bass and mids. The S4R also smoothed out the vocals slightly. On the X55, hip-hop songs lacked the sub-bass rumble, and it was evident that the S4R had more bass presence and impact here. However, the X55 had far more clarity and separation among instruments. Vocals on all the hip-hop songs were at least one step ahead of the mix. All vocals had sparkle that was recorded into the songs, and voices were not smoothed out as they were on the S4R. Overall, the bass response was different on these headphones, but not so much in the amount as in the overall presentation. The X55 has a leaner bass presentation, but with that comes a lot of clarity and excellent separation of instruments. The S4R has a little bit more bass in comparison and is not quite but close to neutral. With that additional bass, you get a little bit more bass and mids melding, however, and noticeably less clarity. Mids are also differently presented in these two headphones. The S4R is smoother, a little bit more neutral. The X55 is cleaner and provides a lot more clarity and separation. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, the X55 presented the vocals 1 to 2 steps ahead of the mix. The drums had very fast transients and were in the background. The bass did not meld with the mids. Orla has natural grain and sibilance recorded into the song. The grain was present without enhancement. Her sibilance was about 1 to 2 decibels elevated, however. On the S4R, Orla's voice is more intimate. It seems closer than it did on the X55. Her voice is also shoulder to shoulder with the other instruments. The grain in Orla's voice is enhanced slightly on the S4R, whereas it was neutral on the X55. Her sibilance was about the same on the S4R as it had been on the X55. There was some bass and mids melding, with the bass guitar and drums having longer decay than they did on the X55. In Want You Back by Haim, the S4R recreated the natural sibilance in the primary vocalist's voice. It was just slightly elevated above neutral, however. There was fairly natural decay in the guitar, drums, and piano. The multiple vocalists in the songs melded considerably, especially when all the instruments were playing. When the instruments were playing lightly, those backup vocalists were a little bit easier to distinguish, but there was no harshness or distortion whatsoever. On the X55, the sound sounded a little smoother. I noticed that the primary vocalist sounded less grainy and her sibilance was more neutral than what I heard on the S4R. This was a difference of a few degrees, not by huge margins. What is huge is the clarity. The X55 had it in spades and the S4R did not. In contrast to the S4R, the X55 presented all the vocals with their individual tonalities, the bass instruments did not bump into the mids, and the decay of all the instruments was faster. In superposition by Young the Giant, the male vocalist was at least one step ahead of the mix on the X55. The bass guitar, ukulele, drums, and vocals were all very well separated. I could hear each element of the song without difficulty. The vocals were clear and smooth. The bass had quick transients and did not interact with the other instruments. The vocals did not have any harshness. The sibilance was neutral. I could hear at least two vocalists in this song. On the S4R, the first thing I noticed was the reverberation and decay of the bass guitar. It was noticeably elevated compared to the X55. It interacted with the other instruments in the mix. The vocals were about shoulder to shoulder with the other elements. I could hear only one vocalist, even though I know the song should present at least two. The vocals sounded a bit warmer on the S4R, meaning they melded slightly with the bass and sounded a bit more intimate, closer. The vocals were not quite as smooth on the S4R as they had been on the X55, but it was by a small difference. Overall, the mids presentation is different by wide margin in one or two respects and by minor degrees in all other respects. The clarity and separation are huge differences. The X55 trumps the S4R in this regard. The smoothness of vocals and decay of instruments is different in smaller portions. Treble presentation was fairly close between these two headphones, but with some minor differences. What I can say generally is that the X55 is ever so slightly more neutral than the S4R where treble is concerned. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the brass and horns shot through the rest of the mix on the S4R, but with that also came a very minor elevation in treble. It did not get harsh or fatiguing, but the treble boost was noticeable. I could not hear the various individual instruments, but could hear group sets. Most of the presentation was dead center. Imaging, therefore, was not particularly impressive. Instruments were either in the left or right ear cup or dead center. There was no sense of width or verticality. On the X55, the brass and horns also came through the mix, but were slightly more neutral. Their treble emphasis was a few decibels reduced from what I heard on the S4R. There was excellent separation between instruments. The double bass did not interact, meld, or distort. On the S4R, the double bass sounded thicker, had more presence, and had longer decay. I could not hear individual instruments on the X55, but group sets were easily discernible. More importantly, instrument placement was superior on the X55. Whereas the S4R had a stereo left or right effect, the X55 had greater specific placement. Some instruments came from the extreme left, some from center, some from slightly off center, and some from all the way to the right. Verticality was missing, just like on the S4R. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the S4R had very neutral, natural presentation of the piano. The piano sounded as if it was about 5 feet away from me. The bassier notes had slightly longer than natural decay, but did not distort. The cello was fairly smooth, but did interact with the piano, melding just a little bit. The piano sounded far more neutral and natural with correct timbre than it did on the NDH-20. Switching to the X55, the piano sounded further back, possibly 8 to 10 feet away. The bassier notes were much less emphasized and had quick transients. All the notes were clearer on the X55 than on the S4R. The cello was also clear and separate from the piano without melding. It sounded smooth and possibly a little bit smoother than what I heard on the S4R. There was no harshness or distortion. Overall, the treble response was not a huge difference. The S4R had a bit more treble emphasis, but only by a few decibels. Instruments were not harsh on either headphone. However, when it comes to clarity, the X55 wins hands down in my opinion. Throughout my test, I kept listening for micro details in the songs. It was easily apparent that the X55 has much better detail than the S4R. It is a very big difference. Small perturbations in voices, creaking of wood, the plucking of string instruments all sounds clearer and more distinct on the X55. On the S4R, some of these details would appear, but most would be lost among the mix. The major contributing factor, I think, is the more elevated bass on the S4R. That bass interacts with the mids and sometimes drowns out the little details hidden in other areas. Was it a night and day difference? Well, yes, I kind of think so. I do not think I ever said that the S4R is a detail monster, because it isn't. Its detail presentation is about average at best. There are worse headphones and there are much better headphones at this. If micro details are not important to you, then the S4R's performance is nothing to scoff at. However, I will have to emphasize that just because the S4R has more elevated bass than the X55, that doesn't mean that the S4R is a bassy headphone, because it isn't. It's not the type of Beats or Sony headphones that you may be used to. Instead, I would say that the S4R has a more neutral presentation of bass than the X55. But the fact that the S4R is simply not able to separate mid-bass from sub-bass, and that the sub-bass and the mid-bass also interact with the mids, is what really causes the differentiation here. Thus, even though the X55 has leaner bass response than the S4R, that leaner bass response results in more clarity. It really just comes down to which flavor you prefer. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This song has many layers of detail, including the sound of children playing in the background, wind, rustling of tall grass, footsteps, piano, and synth. I count the number of footsteps I could hear within the first 60 seconds of the song. The king of detail retrieval in this test is the Focal Clear, which presented 16 footsteps within the first 45 seconds. On the S4R, I heard 7 footsteps in the first minute. On the X55, I heard 14 to 15 footsteps in the first minute. This gap is very similar to what happened when I compared the X55 to the NDH20. Again, the X55's leaner bass and substantial more clarity and separation helped bring out double the amount of detail in this test. The crunching of feet on dry grass was more obvious on the X55. The rustling of the tall grass through the wind was clearer on the X55, and the overall separation of each sound was more transparent on the X55. I tested both headphones on the hifi hip DAC on the Loxg P20. The reason is to find out how these headphones perform when paired with a portable amp DAC and a tube hybrid amp. The hip DAC easily drove both headphones without resorting to the gain boost. The bass boost on the hip DAC does wonders for the X55. The lean bass suddenly has more decay, more emphasis in the sub bass, and a bit more melding with the mid bass. This makes the rumble in mountains and hip-hop songs jump out more and bring those things to life. On the S4R, the bass boost was quite unnecessary. The bass bloated considerably, causing significant melding between sub-bass and mid-bass and creating a distortion. Vocals remained fairly clear, however. On the P20, I used the Western Electric 396A tubes, which are excellent in providing clarity and smoothness. On both headphones, the P20 had a slight tube effect, creating slightly longer bass decay. On the X55, the sub-bass was very slightly affected, with most of the minor emphasis going to the mid-bass. On the S4R, the sub-bass was elevated just slightly, though I really could not be sure, as the bass overall sounded a bit more elevated. The short story is that both of these devices easily drive either headphone. But if you intend to use bass boost as on the hip DAC, the X55 seems to accept the adjustment with more finesse than the S4R. It is a total night and day difference when Soundstage is compared. The X55 has a whole lot more than the S4R. The S4R sounds about average, whereas the X55 sounds above average. The clarity of the X55, the de-emphasized sub-bass and quick transients gives the feeling that the X55 is wider sounding. The S4R by comparison is more intimate, with vocals seeming closer with longer decay of all instruments. Things tend to meld with the S4R. But the S4R has more soundstage than the NDH20, by a considerably and obvious amount. I think that the S4R is one of the most neutral headphones you can buy, especially for about $300. Other companies claim neutral, but they're lying. I think AKG claims that the K361 is a neutral headphone, and that's not true. Audeze also claims that the LCD1 is neutral, and that's a total lie. Neutral means no emphasis in any of the frequency range. Neutral means flat, in my opinion. The S4R isn't truly flat, but it's a lot closer than much more expensive headphones. The bass response is just a tiny bit elevated, but not boomy. The mids are clear and not pushed forward artificially. The treble is close to neutral, but with a tiny bit more energy than actually neutral. The X55, on the other hand, has a de-emphasized sub-bass but a fairly neutral mid-bass. Its vocals are pushed forward just slightly, but the treble is neutral and more so than the S4R. Ollo Audio says their headphones are neutral, and I think that they are pretty close to that mark. Austrian Audio doesn't say anything. They don't claim their headphones are neutral at all. If they had said that, then I would be quite critical. But, thankfully, Austrian Audio made no such claims, and so I cannot hold them to any particular promises. I cannot say that the X55 is an analytical headphone, because I don't think it is. Analytical to me is something like the HD800S or the DT1990. The X55 has an interesting sound, one that is pretty unique. It has the clarity I've only rarely heard on headphones, reminiscent of the Focal Clear. It has the vocal push of something like an Audio-Technica headphone. It has smoothness that reminds me of the ZMF Icon. Of course, these are all very loose comparisons. The X55 doesn't sound exactly like any of them, and that's why I say the X55 is unique. Moreover, I have never before heard the amount of soundstage on a closed-back headphone that I hear from the X55. If you compare the HD800S, you might not be impressed, but compare any other closed-back or even the HD600 series or the LCD1, and you will immediately appreciate what I mean. Even if you compare to the Hi-Fi Man Sundara, you will at least concede that the X55 is not that far off. So, in summation, here's the deal. The S4R is close to neutral, as they say. The X55 is not neutral and does not claim to be. It has a particular sound that can be addicting and helpful in finding details. Unlike the NDH20 comparison, the issue of value is much less clear-cut here. For the NDH20, I said it was an overpriced, overhyped, under-delivering headphone that was not worth more than $350. But the S4R is something different. For about $300, you get excellent neutral-ish sound. The build is sturdy. You can swap every single piece on the Ollo headphones, including the drivers. The headphones do not need to be sent back for repair or upgrade. In fact, if you have one of the older models, you can swap out the newer drivers from the S4X. So, really, that's a lot of versatility. I don't know of any other company that allows this much freedom. On the other hand, the X55 is very much limited. You're stuck with proprietary cables and earpads. You can't service the headphones yourself if you need to. In fact, Austrian Audio is only just about to release earpads and shorter cables for purchase. Both companies have different philosophies. Ollo is squarely aiming towards true neutrality and professional use. They seem to understand that professionals are not particularly forgiving on their gear, which makes the Ollo headphones a great option if you need to replace parts willy-nilly. But the Ollos aren't the best at anything, to be honest. Yes, the neutrality is almost there, and more so than any other headphone that has claimed that title. But neutrality is not everything. Fit, comfort, detail, resolution, soundstage, imaging, all of those things combined make for a fuller picture, one which demands close inspection. So, when I look at Ollo's headphones, I see a very good product that has good sound signature, but not a perfect one. If you're looking for detail, resolution, separation, placement, then the S4R isn't going to deliver anything better than most other headphones. If, instead, you want a headphone that can provide oodles of detail, has excellent object placement, impressive soundstage for either a closed or open back headphone, and mids-forward presentation without harshness, the X55 is a fantastic option. This is a little tough. I cannot tell you to buy one or the other. Frankly, I rarely say what you should buy and mostly tell you what you should not buy. I do not hype products and do not tell you something must be purchased. And the same is true here. The S4R does great work for what it is specifically designed to do. If you want neutral and user-friendly upgradability, well, I can't think of any other headphone that fits those requirements. If you want what the X55 has, soundstage, clarity, resolution, imaging, smoothness, then I cannot think of any other close-back headphone that comes close, so far. So, in the value and conclusion category, it's your call. Pick which one fits your requirements. Both are fairly priced.